Hi, remember me? A year or so ago, I did a stitch to video talking about like a famous crime in your area, and I was talking about the murder of the Roden family. 8 members of one family were murdered in one night. About a year later, I did another video talking about some plea deals. Well, one of the accused killers is on trial this week, so I thought I'd do an update on what's going on. Forgive my appearance, the appearance of my house, and my dog is barking at my neighbor. So I'm going to do a little bit of an update on the trial of one of the members of the Wagner family, which if you scroll back, I don't know how TikTok works, but I'll maybe try to link it or something like that. 4 members of the Wagner family were accused of murdering all 8 members of the Roden family back in 2016. At the time, I lived like 2 roads away from it. We've since moved. It was a big deal. And my husband's from there. It's a very small town, very small community, small county, all of that. And it was a huge deal and way more than that area could handle. So yesterday, the oldest son of the family, his name is George Wagner IV, he goes by George, went on trial finally. A couple weeks ago, they went out and they took the jury to some sites to see the houses where they were, because the houses aren't on site anymore, which will come up later. But then they had to just delay a little bit because somebody was sick, and now they started again. So yesterday they did opening statements. We got through all of the prosecution's opening statements and only 45 minutes of the defense's opening statement. And we found out a few things, and I've got it pulled up here. I'm using the Scioto Valley Guardian website, which is just sciotavalleyguardian.com. If you're interested in reading along with this, they're going to do it day by day. So a few of the interesting things that we learned. The Roden family were not all targets. There were certain targets that they for sure wanted to murder, and then there were people that were just considered collateral damage. The state said that the idea to kill Hannah Roden, which was the mother of Jake Wagner's child, came from Billy Wagner, who was his father. And Jake initially said no, but was encouraged by his parents, which is a whole thing. If you look into the Wagner family, they do everything together. Everything is made as a family decision. It's super fucking weird. So they were going to kill Hannah and make it look like her boyfriend at the time, his name was Corey, did it. That was the initial plan. They also needed to take care of a few of her family members that they said knew things, and they knew would come after them and either retaliate or go after them to kill them or call the police or something. That was her father, Chris Sr., her Uncle Gary, and her brother, Frankie. Go to part 2. George Wagner trial, day 1, part 2, just because I had to do a lot of explanation. So there's a lot to cover that we learned in the opening statement. Now, keep in mind the opening statement is not evidence, but basically they're saying what they're going to present as evidence, or hopefully they will, because they made a lot of claims that they're really going to need to prove, basically. So the first thing to note, and this is kind of out of order in the order of the opening statement, which I believe is still available on the Scioto Valley Guardian's Facebook page. I believe that they still have the live streams. However, I will note that if you do want to watch these, a lot of it's muted because the witnesses don't want to be on camera. So one of the main things that we learned is that Hannah Roden, and there are 2 Hannahs in the story, so this is Hannah Roden, Hannah Mae is what they call her. Hannah Mae was pregnant at 15 by Jake Wagner, who was 20 at the time. She met him when she was 13, was given permission to date him because her father, Chris Sr., was friends with Jake's father, Billy Wagner, and they had a long-standing relationship. They were in a marijuana growing business together, and it's gone from there. So they named the baby Sophia before she was born, and even before she was born, Jake apparently had told Hannah he would take the baby by force if necessary, wanting her to come and live with the Wagners and be under the Wagners' control. And they have several other examples, including George, who's currently on trial. George's ex-wife, Tabitha, who is also on the Piketon Murders podcast, about her children that she had with George and how she was basically bullied into giving them up. And they wanted Sophia to call Angela, who was Jake's mother, the baby's grandmother, Mom, because they apparently thought she was like the perfect mother, and I find that pretty hard to believe. Apparently, there were some physical fights between Hannah and Jake, and they finally broke up in 2015. And then Hannah was talking to a family member of Tabby, who was George's ex-wife, on Facebook in a private conversation about how the Wagners would have to kill her first before she would sign any papers giving custody to them of baby Sophia. It's also worth pointing out that by way of the defense's opening statement later on, they are claiming that George had nothing to do with this. This is all about his brother, his father, and his mother. And honestly, they might have a case there, so I'm not sure what to believe. I'm sure he was involved in some way, but they said that Jake will testify that George didn't kill anybody and that George didn't have anything to do with it. His defense attorney also said that Angela, the mother's motive, was that she believed Sophia was being molested by the Roden family, and Jake's motive was jealousy, control, and custody of his daughter. The dad's motive was drugs because he was in it with Chris Sr., and George didn't have any motive at all. Part 3. Okay, last part, because today was day 2, and I still got to wrap that shit up too, so that I can do a daily one after this. So I mentioned earlier that there were targets, intended targets, and then there was collateral damage, which I've said a long time ago that the saddest one to me is the brother, Frankie Roden's fiance, Hannah Hazel Gilly, because there's 2 Hannahs, because she was like 19, 20 years old with some guy who was into derby cars and chicken fighting and all this random stuff that, I mean, honestly, who hasn't dated somebody that was a bad idea when you were 20 years old? But most of us didn't get murdered in our sleep over it. So the prosecutor said that the intended target was Chris Roden Sr., who was involved with drug deals with Billy Wagner. Gary Roden was killed simply because he was present, and the rest of the family was murdered because they knew things. All of the victims except for 3, Dana, Gary, and Chris Sr., were killed in their sleep, according to the state. So it's important to note, Dana was in a house that was hers. It was bought for her by her ex-husband, Chris Sr. They were divorced. However, they were friends, and for all intents and purposes, were great friends. And she was in the house with Hannah Mae Roden, her daughter, and her youngest son, Chris Jr., who was 17 years old. Down the road was her ex-husband, Chris Sr., living in a trailer, and his cousin from, I believe, Kentucky, was visiting and staying with him. That is Gary Roden. So all the killings happened in one night, starting in they believe, the late hours of April 21st, 2016, until they were found early in the morning on the 16th of 2016. So they claim that Billy Wagner, the father, left his phone with his wife the night of the murders and planned a meeting with Chris Sr. to talk about a big drug deal out west, quote unquote, that was upwards of 30 grand in marijuana. They grew pot together. They sold it. When he went over there to talk about it, he asked Chris Sr. to call his phone because he couldn't find it. And when he called, apparently Angela answered the phone to establish where the phone was, that it would ping at his house, that it would establish an alibi. I'm not going to be able to finish this in 3 parts. It's going to have to be a 4th one to catch up because the opening statements were a lot. So there were 4 scenes. At the first one, it was Chris Sr. and Gary. They were found by a family member, Bobby Joe Manley, who worked feeding his animals in exchange for living on his property. And when she found them, she called 911. There's a call that you can find and listen to that said it looked like they'd been beat to death. Now, keep in mind, these 2 were not asleep. They actually fought, and I believe that comes up later. There's a lot of defensive wounds and things on them. So Bobby Joe ran next door to Frankie's house. It was unlocked by his 3-year-old who told them Daddy had a lot of blood. She came in, found they had a 6-month-old that was laying in between them that was unharmed, and the 3-year-old was unharmed. But Frankie and Hannah Hazel were dead, shot in their sleep, and were obviously deceased. I'm almost done, but I am going to talk about the final 2 scenes where they found people. And the main one I'm going to talk about is Hannah Mae Gilly, who was the obvious intended target, the mother of Sophia, who also was laying in bed next to her newborn baby that at the time they thought could potentially be Jake's. It is very traumatic. I'm going to put in a trigger warning right here that if you're not okay with this sort of thing with very detailed descriptions, you might want to just skip forward about, I don't know, a minute or so. So first they found in this house Dana Roden, which was her mother. She had worked a double shift at the nursing home where she worked. She was awake and she was playing on her cell phone in bed after a double shift. Jake shot her, went and killed Hannah and Chris Jr. in their beds, then came back and shot her several more times and placed a pillow over her head, where her brother found her later with the pillow over her head. So first he killed Hannah, and then he went into Chris Jr.'s room and killed him in his sleep. Hannah was asleep technically, but Hannah did wake up. I'm just going to read what this says. Hannah woke up and saw Jake standing in the doorway, but the state said she did not realize it was him and when Jake opened fire and killed her. She was nursing a newborn baby by another man, which at the time they did not know that. The man was not there, but was supposed to be. But the baby was in bed with its mother. Jake allegedly repositioned Hannah's dead body in bed so the infant could continue to nurse even after the killings. The baby was not harmed. Sorry, I lost my place. And then finally they went to the fourth site, which was Kenneth Roden, who I believe is another cousin or an uncle or something like that. He lived in a camper that didn't have running water, and he was due to go. He would go to Gary and Chris Sr.'s house every day to take a shower before he went to work. He went in pretty early, apparently. And they killed him because he would know it was the Wagners who carried out the act. He was shot in the eye while he slept. Few more random odds and ends. There were shell casings that were found at the scenes of the crimes, where the bodies were found, which matched shell casings that were found in the driveway of the Wagners. And in what is quite possibly the dumbest way to dispose of a murder weapon I've ever heard, they put the murder weapons in buckets, filled them with concrete, and gave them to a family member on Father's Day as boat anchors that were later cut and dropped to the bottom of a pond. Jake Wagner later confessed, and they went out and found them and found the murder weapons when they cut this open and found the guns. They had proof of murder shoes being purchased at Walmart because they matched footprints that were in the house. The state tried to place listening devices in with the Wagner stuff, and including in a semi-truck driven by Jake and George, but they were always on high alert that they were being listened to, so they really didn't get much. George apparently, after the murders, had nightmares, and Angela replied, "I don't know why he's having nightmares. He didn't kill anybody." And in the weirdest part, Jake Wagner was obsessed with the actor Norman Reedus, and he carried out the murders like Boondock Saints and saw him and his brother as Boondock Saints.